Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today I want to talk about my process for making combo or segmented scales. So let's jump into it and I'll show you how I make these. All right, first things first, what is a segmented or a combo scale? A combo scale is just a knife scale made out of a combination of materials. So you can dream up any combination of materials that you want and it'll pretty much work. So for example, this one's G10 with some G10 liner material. Those are those skinny lines, and then denim micarta, and then more liner material, and then spalted maple on the bottom. You can use, things like mammoth tusk. You can use, other colors of G10. You can use carbon fiber. You can use all kinds of different materials, but they give a classy look to a knife. And my first tip for making these is I actually got the tip from Tony over at Under the Bridge Scales, but I was trying to glue up my spacer material, this centerpiece, cut to almost the same height as the scale and, the same width. And he was like, no, that's, I was having trouble with pieces sliding during glue up and everything. He said, just take a piece of G10, or, that's what I was using at the time. Just take a piece, use your liners and put them on the outside of it, sandwich it in between, and glue it all up into one piece. And then you can take this either on this end or this end, and depending on the width of your scale, you can cut this down to whatever you want, and then, cut it on the bandsaw, and you're not having to worry about stuff slipping and sliding around. So that was a super useful tip. I used it for this last batch of segmented scales, and I really like it. So, well, that's my first tip, and now we'll move on to how to square up and start assembling all your different pieces. If you don't have something like a disc sander where you can get a spacer like this, cut at a perfect 90-degree angle. So my bandsaw cuts, it's just a porta band, and it cuts at a weird angle, so it's not perfectly 90. And you can see here I have a 1-2-3 block on my granite surface plate. This is just a slab of granite that I got from a countertop store for free. And you can see here it's sitting down on there. My 1-2-3 block is sitting, and there's a gap right here. So you see that gap? So what I do is I'll use this to check, and if I have it this way, it looks like it's square. But you check it on both sides, and you can tell it's not. The reason that it looks square this way is because this edge over here is high. So it's leaning into the 1-2-3 block. Now the high edge is over here, and it's pushing it out away from it. And you can see there's a bit of a gap. So I'll show you how I do this by hand. All right, so what I do is I use a adhesive backed, a PSA backed sandpaper. This is made by Indasa. This is called their Rhino Stick. They sell it in rolls. You can get it in different grits. You can get it from Maritime Knife Supply or Eastwood. There's a number of places that carry this, but all you do is you can crease it like that, and then it tears really easily. So you can pick whatever length you want, peel the back off, stick it down. I like this versus doing spray adhesive and putting down sheets of paper, or trying to wet my surface plate and laying a sheet of sandpaper down, because this peels up really easily, doesn't leave behind any residue, and it holds secure. So, all right, so we have this piece that is out of square, and what I'll do is I'll put the high side away, and I run my 1, 2, 3 block up against the edge. I don't want it on there because it's going to tilt my 1, 2, 3 block and it's going to wear on that. I just have it up against the edge, and then I press my spacer or whatever material that I'm trying to square up against the 1, 2, 3 block, and then I'll sand back and forth. And we can tell that the outer edge is the high edge because it's removing material on that edge and not up against the block. So we just do that until we get even material removal along the surface of this. Okay, we have an even surface. It should be good, but let's double check. So clean off any dust surface block. So 1, 2, 3 blocks sitting down. This is sitting down. There's no side-to-side movement in that direction. We'll flip it around, and no side-to-side movement there. And then we can move on to fitting it up to the other portions of the handle material. And just to show you how easily this sandpaper comes off this surface plate, that's as easy as it gets. Sometimes if you put a ton of pressure, it may stick harder, but you can get under the edge with a razor blade, peel it up, and it comes right off, and there's no adhesive residue left on that plate, and I can reapply another piece right there. Okay, for this set of segmented scales, we're going to be using a piece of white G10, my spacer that I made, which has black and white G10 with some denim micarta. And then I'm using a bunch of different pieces of wood, but this one is getting this wood right here. So that's what the scale is going to look like. But I need to make sure that I mate up all these surfaces. So when I cut this G10 out, you can see it's pretty rough cut on this side, it's rough cut on this side, and so forth. I left one of the factory edges because with most suppliers that you get G10 from, they use like a tile saw to cut, and it leaves a really nice edge. You can always touch it up on the sandpaper just a little bit. Just make sure that you're not tilting it one way or the other. Otherwise you'll knock it out of square. But we know that this piece is square, so we're gonna mate this up to get light in on this. So that gap up top there there's no gap. It is nice and flush, and I'm making sure to press this down and press this down and then press them in together so everything's flat on the flat surface. Okay, so we can see that these fit up good, but let's give an example of what they would look like if they didn't. So this top surface is still rough cut, so let's flip it over. We know it's not square. So you may run into a situation like this where you have a big gap. And you know you need to adjust your material to get rid of that gap. And you can't just do that by pushing it over, because that lifts this bottom edge. This edge right here, it lifts that up. And so when you're clamping everything flat down, it's going to open up that gap. So that's kind of what I'm talking about there. Now let's do it like this. And you can see there's a gap at the bottom. Right there, there's a gap at the bottom. So that's why we check along the edge. And sometimes when the surface is mated up flush, it's difficult to see that gap, so I shift it back a little bit. And then you'll be able to see if the bottom is flush as well or if it's out of square. So those are some things to look for. So this one is good to go. And then I always mark my surfaces, my material, so I know which side went to which. All right, so let's mark these real quick. So I just do like a 1 and a 1, and I'll put arrows. And then I know that this side goes to that side. This is the top, this is the top. So nothing, it shouldn't matter since it's all square. But this side, we didn't square off. It's rough cut, so that'll be tilted. Okay, now we need to fit the bottom piece to the spacer. And here you can see I cut this on the bandsaw and I did an abysmal job. So if I was going to mate that up, I would have big old gaps in there. You can see those big old air gaps in there. So either I have to sand this so it's square and it's a flat surface to mate up against this one. Or if whoever you got your scales from, if they have a really nice clean cut on here, you can see if that matches up better. But you can kind of pick, and it depends on the grain. If you're trying to do matching grain, then you want to make sure that you do the same thing on the other scale. Especially if you have spalting that's like matchbooked, anything like that, it'll look wonky if you have it up at the top of one end or it doesn't match. It's just that extra detail that you want to go into when making a set of scales. So another piece of advice is when you're squaring up really tall pieces, it's easy to put more pressure or tip when you're going back and forth. It would be easy for this to tip forward, rock forward when I'm pushing forward, or rock back when I'm going back. So you have to be very mindful of the pressure that you're applying. The 1, 2, 3 block doesn't hold that right in place, but one thing that can help is to hold it down at the bottom instead of at the top, so you're reducing your moment arm, and sand like that. So still have quite a bit of material to remove, so I'll do that and then we'll come back and check the fit up. Okay, another thing here is this section of sandpaper will wear out faster because you're rubbing it right on that edge. You can use an eraser to clear the material out of it, just like you would on like a belt, a sanding belt. You can use this on here to clear the material out of the pores of the sanding paper. But another thing is once you have this square, if you have like some deep gouge marks, you can go over to the center of the sandpaper and just make sure that you're applying even pressure so it's flat and go back and forth in the center. You just have to be careful that you're not adding pressure one way or the other to take it out of square. But you can get to fresh material here in the middle and still achieve the same result. But I like to move a little bit slower to make sure that I'm holding that surface as flat as possible against the sandpaper. Okay, so we have the two pieces. This side goes to the G10. This side will go to the wood. All right, we're pressing down and up against it. It is flush, there are no gaps. Okay, one other tip. When you're checking that your surfaces are matching up, you can't tell here. It's difficult to see because there's all this sawdust on this surface. So wipe that down, and then you can tell that sawdust isn't in your way, and you can tell if they're matching up. And same like down here, wipe that off, and then you can tell if they're matching up. Pretty good. A little bit of gap up at the top. I went too far in the opposite direction. Okay, last piece of advice is picking which side of the wood you want. So this is going to be up. The bottom section of your scale is going to get a liner. You can surface grind these and flip them after the fact, but I like to lessen the number of steps that I have. So I pick the side of the wood that I want up. So an example of that is I have this nice piece of spalted wood here, and I have some ant holes on this portion. So I know that the thickness of this is going to come down to match my G10. and I want to make sure that I'm not getting into something. That's why I cut this off. This is scrap. I'm not using this because it was going to expose that ant hole or wormhole in the face of my scale. So pick your surface based on appearance and functionality. And that way, when you're doing your glue ups and everything like that, you don't have to do extra steps. Okay, for gluing these up, I like to use G-Flex epoxy. I've tried some other things and I haven't found anything better than G-Flex. So this is just a one-to-one epoxy, and it's a really slow cure. It takes probably 45 minutes to start to get tacky, like 3 or 4 hours to like set, and then like 12 hours to cure. So it's a great epoxy. I really like it. If you guys use something else that you really like and have good success with, let me know. Drop in the comments, because I'd be curious to try it out. The only downside to this is that it does take so long to cure. So you got to wait forever before you can like unclamp stuff or have scales ready to grind. So yeah, anyways, so we'll go ahead and get this mixed up. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to have a piece of flat bar stock metal that I've wrapped some parchment paper around, and then I use acetone, or you can use alcohol, like rubbing alcohol, to clean off the mating surfaces. Just wipe those down, get all the debris and oils and whatever else that's kicking around your shop off of those surfaces. Another thing I didn't mention is you want to use a pretty coarse sandpaper, because you want these mating glue up surfaces to have a whole bunch of ridges in them. So you need to use a fine enough that it's not leaving gaps at where they meet up, but it's rough enough that you have good bonding surface for your epoxy. Okay, epoxy's all mixed up. I like to put it on both surfaces to make sure that you have good adhesive contact on both surfaces. Is to do just apply it to both surfaces. So I put it on both, on these two, and I missed a spot. There we go. And then I'll take them and press them together, kind of rub them back and forth, line it up where I want it. And then we'll put some more on this one. And then rub those back and forth. They're sticking well. I'll glue these up, and then I'll show you how I clamp them together. Okay, so these have epoxy on them. You can see it oozing out at the top there. But it's just not good enough to set these on here and hope that they glue up so there's no tiny gaps. So what I like to do is I'll take some clamps and I'll clamp down the top one, because I'm going to be pushing up on this to seat that whole scale together. So this is just holding it in place. What I like is some type of quick release clamp or something that you can get on there quickly. Get this in the center so I'm not putting pressure on one side of the scale or the other. And then I'm gonna press up with my thumb, hold this down, and tighten that. I'll loosen this up with one hand, press forward to make sure everything's seated really nice, and then push down. The other thing that you want to do is that center spacer can work its way up with that epoxy in there. So what I like to do is just take a few of these clamps and clamp it down. So those are set. And now I'll take this out of the vise, set it back on the bench, and let it cure up. Normally I just let them sit overnight for like 8 hours, and then I'll come back out, and then we'll go to the next step. All right, so these scales glued up, cured up overnight, and I unclamped them. So pull them off here. And here you can see clamping them flat prevented this spacer from coming up or anything buckling. So we have a nice fit up on both of these. There's no gaps between the spacer material, and you can really tell when there's white on black. But yeah, no gaps, super good fit up. And now flatten the backs of these and glue on our spacer or liner material. So this is just 0.035 white G10. Okay, we're back over at the surface plate with the sandpaper, and I'm just going to sand this and see how out of flat they are. If it's going to take me forever on the surface plate, I will move to the flat platen on my belt grinder, and then I'll come back and do my final tuning on the surface plate. Okay, so it looks like we're removing material up here, and then there is epoxy here, and we're removing, it's kind of hard to tell down on the bottom, there's some material being removed right in this area. This is pretty common of what I see. I may take this one to the grinder because it's going to be a lot to do it by hand. Even though it looks relatively flat and sitting on the surface plate, it feels pretty flat. But I don't want that to cause like a slight, this layer of epoxy that's here in the middle that leaked underneath. I don't want that to create the tiniest of little gaps once I get my liner up on there. So I'm going to get this perfectly flat. And the other reason that you want to do that is because you can clamp liner onto this. It's flexible enough that it'll go into a concave or a convex. But then when you put it on your knife handle, you want it to be dead flat. You don't want any rock or gaps or anything like that. So even though you can conform liner to a surface like this that's out of flat a little bit, it'll cause you problems later when you're doing your pin up and your glue up onto your knife. Okay, we have this sanded. It is dead flat now, except for this little tiny spot here and a little bit on this corner, but that's below where my scale is going to lay out on my knife, and I'm not worried about it. So these are good to go. I will take a scribe pen or a metal scribe, and scratch up the back of this to make sure that I get good surface area for my glue up. Because right now this 220 grit it's actually looking really nice on this wood. Getting some chatoyance out of it already, so I think this one's going to finish up beautifully. But you can also see here, no gaps between the top section, the spacer, and the bottom section. So that's exactly what we're looking for. So get the other one done, and then I'll show you how I prep the liners and do the glue up. Okay, we have both scales sanded flat on the backs, and they're almost ready for liners. So we're going to get those cut out. When you're doing liner material, since the epoxy is going to make it like super slippery, my suggestion is to oversize it by like 1/8 of an inch on either side. It'll just keep you from struggling when you're clamping up, because those surfaces just like to shift and slide. If I cut this exactly and it shifts just a little bit, then it's overhung and I can't use that portion of the scale. So I oversize it by 1/8. You could go up to even 1/4, and just give yourself some wiggle room on your liner. It'll make your life so much easier. Okay, so you do need to rough up the surface of these, and I like to take them and run them across my belt this way and then across my belt that way. So it gives me a hatch pattern. You just have to make sure that you don't gouge them out because that'll create space. So I like to do this way. You can do it this way, but you have to have a very light hand to make sure that you're not creating waves and gouges in them. So. Okay, just like before, we're going to be using G-Flex epoxy, and I'm going to wipe down these surfaces, make sure there's no residual like Sharpie marks, oils, or debris on them. Okay, epoxy's mixed. These are ready to go. I will add a good amount of epoxy on the back of these. So quite a bit of epoxy on there because I'm not going to add it to both surfaces. I'm going to put this down on here and I'm going to move it around and make sure that every contact surface is sticking well. So we're going to shift it around as I'm adding pressure. And I'll bring you in close so you can see why we oversized our liner material. Okay, so just as I was moving the camera, this scale has slid off of this liner material already. So that's just because this bar that I have in the vise isn't perfectly level. And so you can see how easily they move around. But I have extra material around every side. And so if it shifts a little bit as I'm clamping it up, which it will, it's still on the outside of that scale and it's not gonna prevent me from using that portion. So you always wanna make your scales oversized. Don't try to shape them to your knife and then make them, especially with segmented ones, because getting these liners to line up perfectly, it would be a total nightmare. So always make them oversized and oversize your liners. So when you're doing your glue up, it's easy for you. If you have normal clamps, you can just use these, and I like to space them evenly around. See how that shifted when I clamped it down? It pushed it way over that way. So that's why I don't like using C twist clamps, because when you're adding that pressure down, they like to shift around on you. So it takes a lot of little finagling. And you don't want to clamp this down super duper tight, just enough to hold it in place and get a good, fit up between those pieces, which they're both dead flat, so they should fit up nicely. But you don't want to clamp them down so much that they're just like squeezing all your epoxy out. So clamp them down decently, but not too hard. And since I globbed a lot of epoxy on here, I am going to get some squeeze out, but that's okay. Don't be afraid to squeeze out. More epoxy is better than not enough. You can use other clamps. You can use clamps like this, where they get even pressure right in the middle. These work great. You can use big quick grips. Just as long as you're getting even pressure across this whole scale. Okay, so how I like to do that, how I like to clean up these is I have a surface grinder. So I will take a flat scrap piece of steel, and I'm going to zoom you out here so you can see what I'm doing. All right, so we have a flat piece of steel, and I lay down a piece of masking tape on it. And then I will take these, put masking tape in the center of them. Okay. And then a little bit of Star Bond CA glue, some CA glue, and put a couple dots on each. You don't have to use this, but I like to use activator. Center them on there. Stick them down. So there we go. They are now, you can see, they're attached to that piece of steel. I can stick this to my magnetic chuck on my surface grinder and then surface grind these both down to the same thickness. Because you don't want one scale on one side of your knife to be thicker than the scale on the other side. You want them to be dead even. And when you're using non-traditional materials like this, sometimes it can be difficult to get them the same thickness. And I really like using the surface grinder. So I wanted to step in here real quick. When I was editing that video, I realized that I didn't provide an alternative for how to flatten out those scales if you don't have a surface grinding attachment. And so the way that I used to do it before I had my surface grinding attachment is just on the flat platen. So I would take and hold these carefully so my fingers are away from the belt, run this at slower speeds, and use very fresh belt, really sharp abrasives, to grind down the high spots and get it to one even flat surface. And then to verify the thickness of the scales so they're even between the both, I just use a set of calipers to measure them as I go. And then I would finish it up on the surface block to get any last little tweaks that I wanted to do on there. So my apologies, I realize that not everyone has a $1,200 tooling arm surface grinder attachment for their grinder. They're not doing this as a living like I am, so but that's how I used to do it before I got that. So just on the flat platen, slow, careful, and you can get them to where they're actually very good. So just takes a little bit of time and practice and you'll get there. Okay, so we have the Ameribraid surface grinder attachment put into the grinder. And I'm going to use the mag chuck to hook these scales on. And then we'll bring it out, tooling arm out. So it's just barely touching these, the spacers. Okay, that should be good. We can check the alignment of the belts. Sometimes I have to track the belt up and down because the scales are wider than the 2-inch belt. So I'll show you something here. I was grinding scales before and I had the belt up grinding this area. And I went in deep to where there was actually a portion of the scale that was sticking out, and it ate into my contact wheel here on my surface grinder attachment. So you can see there's a groove in that wheel, and that's just from like G10 digging into it because I didn't track the belt up and down. Something to be aware of and to be careful so you don't ruin your equipment. The other thing, when I'm grinding these scales, I like to use a 36 grit when I'm hogging off a bunch of material, like on spacers and stuff. I will go to a finer belt for a good finish if I'm not going to be hand sanding. A 36 grit really helps keep things cool on these scales. You don't want these to warm up because that glue can release, or the epoxy can release, or it can warp. So you try to take things slow and really keep it cool while you're working on these. So I like a fresh 36 because it really rips that material off and it doesn't heat things up. So I am clamping the vacuum nozzle right here. That's going to act as my dust collection, but it's not foolproof, so we're definitely wearing a respirator. You should be wearing a respirator 95% of the time in the knife shop, but yep, so here we go. Here's kind of what I was talking about. So you can see here, I've have the belt tracked down and I'm grinding the bottom of that, but up here I have this little jut out, this little nub, and you can see it's getting close to that contact wheel. I'm going to track the belt up and grind that little nub off, and to just keep shifting it up and down. Okay, so we have a set of freshly surface ground handle scales. I'll show you how I take them off of here. To take these off, I will pull on the liners and get it to start coming. If it doesn't want to peel up, you just, use a knife to kind of pop them loose. Don't be cutting towards yourself, please. But just peel them up, peel the tape off, and there you go. These are ready to clean up on the edges. We'll double check the flatness on the back, just in case they got a slight warp in them. But yeah, isn't this burled ironwood just awesome? So put that knife under there and boop. There we go. So these two are the exact same thickness. Dead flat on the front. And yeah, we'll get ready to put them on a knife. That should wrap things up for this video. That's my process for making combo or segmented scales. I hope it was helpful for some of you. And if you have any questions or suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. On my next video, I'm going to show you how I line up the spacers on either side of the tang so you get a good finished product on your knife build. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.